In this Elden Ring video, I'm going to be showing you my Sword Sage build, which is a build that uses the Sword of Night and Flame, and a couple of other spells that you probably have never tried. A lot of people have been asking me to make a build revolving around this sword. This is a sword that uses 12 Dexterity and Strength and 24 Int and Faith. It's kind of a weird weapon because most spells either use Intelligence or they use Faith. They don't typically use both, but in this build, we're actually going to use a couple spells that use both. So the first thing you're obviously going to want for this build is the Sword of Night and Flame. This is located in Caria Manor. It's kind of like hidden on the bottom floor. You got to go up top, like along the ramparts, and then drop down to an area, and you'll be able to pick this up. It's not very hard to get at all, and it upgrades with Somber Stones, which is fantastic. This straight sword actually does physical damage, it does magic damage, and it does fire damage. The magic damage scales with your intelligence, and the fire damage scales with your faith, while the physical damage scales with your strength and dexterity. The scaling for magic and fire damage improves as you upgrade the weapon, like pretty much the whole way, so you're probably going to want to put points into intelligence and faith, and not really focus on dexterity and strength if you make a build with this weapon. Also, you're not going to have a whole lot of stat points to spread around here between those four stats if you still want to get points into vigor and mind, which you do with this build. So you're probably just going to focus on intelligence and faith if you're using this weapon. What's really amazing about this weapon is the weapon arts that are on it. They are just absolutely fantastic. If you hold L2, you sort of enter a stance, and then if you hit R1, you do sort of like a comet beam, kind of like this spell that does absolutely devastating magic damage. And if you hit R2 instead of R1, you sort of do this AoE sweep with your sword that does a bunch of fire damage. So you get magic and fire damage with two different button presses on this weapon. So depending on the enemy that you're facing, maybe it's weak to fire, maybe it's weak to magic. Absolutely fantastic damage either way. You can often one-shot or two-shot most enemies with these abilities, and the FP cost is like 19 and 23. And since we use the Carrion Filigreed Crest in this build, we reduce that by another 25%, which just allows you to use these constantly throughout your playthrough and just absolutely eliminate any obstacle in your way in a matter of seconds. Other equipment you're going to want for this build is the Meteorite Staff. This is a fantastic staff, and you don't need to upgrade it. It's going to allow you to cast the sorceries we want to use for this build and any other sorceries you might want. It's not the ideal staff for this build, but it's the best you can do right now. One really, really critical part of this build that you get a little bit further after 50, I'd say level 70 or so in the game, is the Prince of Death Staff, which we're going to swap this out for. I didn't think it would be fair to put in this build because you're probably not going to have it at level 50, but it's not going to be too much longer until you get it. What's really great about that staff is it scales with faith and intelligence, which you're going to be pumping both because of that the Sword of Night and Flame scales with both very well. And it also increases the damage of death spells, which we use with this build. So it's kind of a double whammy, and you're going to see this build jump significantly in performance once you acquire that staff. Another weapon we want for this build is a dagger. You don't have to use a dagger. It can be any really light weapon. The idea is to keep the weight low. You're going to put determination on that. So when you're casting your sorceries, you're boosting the damage. If you saw my video on the mage build, or the sorcerer build rather, you can actually boost the damage of your incantations and sorceries by buffing with determination and then not attacking and just casting spells for the duration, which is about 10 seconds. This is fantastic. It doesn't really help too much with the spells we use for this build because their damage isn't very good at this point in the game, but it will if you use other spells, so keep that in mind. Armor-wise, I'm using the Queen's Crescent Crown in order to get 3 intelligence with no negatives. There are other helmets you can get that increase your intelligence more than this, that give you a side effect like lower health or lower stamina, which I don't recommend. But at this point in the game, we need to reach at least 34 intelligence, so if you want to use one of them, I wouldn't blame you, but you'll probably want to swap it out as you get higher levels and you don't need that intelligence as much. The other armor, you just want to use the best you can and still medium roll. You're not going to have a ton of armor at this point in the game, like very, very good armor, because you just don't have equip load, because all the points are going into faith and intelligence. But as you progress this build further into the game and you have more endurance and things like that, you're going to be able to equip better armor. The 3 talismans we want to use for this build at this point are Marika's Seal, Radagon Icon, and Carrion's Filigreed Crest. Marika's Seal is pretty much a must at this point in order to meet the requirements we need for the spells that we want to use and the weapon. And you'll probably swap this out later. It's going to give you a boost to Faith, Intelligence, Arcane, and Mind, and of those we need Faith, Mind, and Intelligence, so that's really, really good for this build. But getting that damage taken isn't so good, and you don't have nearly as much vigor as you probably want at this point in the game, so eventually you want to swap that out, but it's very good to have at this point. Radagon Icon increases the cast speed of your spells, so any, spells that you're casting, like the ones we're using in this build, will be increased, and any that you want to add to it as well. It's just a very, very good talisman to have all around. And lastly, as I mentioned already, Carrion's Filigreed Crest reduces the cost of your weapon skills by 25%, since you're going to use them a lot with this build, because the Sword of Night and Flame is fantastic. It doesn't need a damage boost. Otherwise, the Warrior's Jar Shard would be good for this build at this point if you want to kill Alexander, or you can wait to do his questline to get a better version. But 25% reduction is going to allow you to use these a lot more before you need to chug a pot, and that's just fantastic. The two spells that we use for this build are Rancor Call and Ancient Death Rancor. They aren't going to be at peak performance at this point without that Prince of Death staff, because that's really going to boost their damage. But they still do significant damage, and you're going to notice that Ancient Death Rancor specifically does incredible stagger damage. Rancor Call does good stagger damage early on, but Ancient Death Rancor does incredible stagger damage to enemies. You can just stagger them outright with this spell. And what it allows you to do is it allows you to get breathing room to use your weapon skills, or just to run and attack enemies as they're constantly getting staggered by your skulls that are flying at them. These spells do not set Blight buildup, unlike some of them that are being cast by enemies in the game that look very similar to this. So you're not going to set Blight buildup on other players if you're PvPing, or other enemies if you're PvEing. But again, what you're really using this spell for is having a ranged option, and also staggering enemies to give you an opening to use your weapon skills, or just staggering them in general. Maybe you're on horseback and you're riding around, you stagger them, hop off, smack them in the face with a critical attack, whatever. But the damage of these at this point isn't going to be as high as it should be. Remember that you can buff them with Determination before spamming them, but it does give you a ranged option, and once you get that Prince of Death staff, they're really going to do a lot more damage. Keep in mind that you can add other spells to this build because you are using a staff. You can use things like Glintstone Pebble, or Loretta's Great Bow. They're going to do really well at this point in the game with 34 intelligence, which is about what you would have on a mage build anyway, maybe a little bit less. You're going to be a little bit squishier because your stat spread is all over the place compared to a mage build at this point. But as you go on in the game, that will be less and less the case. So this build plays a lot kind of like a Spellblade. It's kind of like just a different version of a Spellblade with different abilities and things like that. You're going to go around mostly just attacking regular things or using your spells to pick off enemies at range. Like Rancor Call, for instance, does about double the damage of Glintstone Pebble, and it costs about double, so it's roughly the same amount of damage as 2 Glintstone Pebbles in some cases. And you're going to use your weapon skills. You're going to use that R1 probably far more than the R2 to take out like groups of enemies. You can line them up, take out multiple enemies at once, or you can get into AoE situations where you hit R2 and just take out like a whole cluster of enemies at one swipe. Talking about attributes for this build, at this point we have 20 Vigor, 21 Mind, 12 Strength, 12 Dexterity, 34 Intelligence, 24 Faith. Don't really need Arcane at all for this build. Keep in mind that these stats shown are with Marika's Scarseal equipped, so you'll have 3 less in Mind, Intelligence, and Faith. Marika's Scarseal really good here, particularly this early on. You have to hit a couple of breakpoints that are really important for this build. 24 Faith, 24 Intelligence is a must to use the Sword of Night and Flame, so you have to have that, along with 12 Strength and 12 Dexterity, which is why those are sitting there. You also need 34 Intelligence in order to use Ancient Death Rancor. This, again, is a spell that has Faith and Intelligence requirements, and so does Rancor Call. A lot of the death spells, if not all of the death spells, have Faith and Intelligence requirements with slightly more Intelligence. So as you advance this build throughout the game, you're going to get benefit out of increasing Intelligence and Faith, and you'll probably continue to increase them a little bit more on the Intelligence side. Why these spells work really well for this build is because you're already increasing Intelligence and Faith to increase your damage with Sword of Night and Flame, so it makes sense to use them here. And once you have the Prince of Death staff, you're going to get scaling from both Intelligence and Faith, which is absolutely incredible. So the scaling on that staff is going to be phenomenal. At this point in the game, because you're using Meteorite staff, you're only getting scaling from your Intelligence stat. Imagine later on when you have a staff that gives you Intelligence and Faith scaling, both applying to your sorcery scaling. It's going to be absolutely fantastic. And Vigor 20 is pretty much the minimum I recommend for any build at this level, and 21 Mind isn't enough. You need way more Mind because you're going to spam abilities, but you just can't meet these requirements at level 50. As you get higher level, it's going to ease up the pressure on these stats in order to meet these thresholds for spells, and you're going to get more and more Mind and more Vigor. Just a couple final tips about this build before I wrap up the video. These spells, Rancor Call and Ancient Death Rancor, work really well in co-op situations where you can just continuously stagger a boss as long as you have FP, and that'll get better and better as you get a higher FP pool. because you're not really worried about the damage of these spells, even though you will increase it later on. But if you could just keep spamming these spells, which you can also charge with R1 to deal increased damage, in case I didn't mention that. But if you just keep spamming them into bosses, they will never be able to do anything in most cases, and your teammates will just be able to just pound them into the ground and then get a critical attack, and you can just can't kind of repeat this process. So it works really, really well in co-op situations. And if you're playing in a PvP situation where, like, maybe the invader is targeting the host, and you can start firing these into his back, it works really well because these things chase really far, and it'll make that invader have to, like, really dodge out of the way and keep dodging while he's trying to focus on the host, which is very, very hard to do. And lastly, there doesn't seem to be, unlike some of the Souls games, any sort of seal or sorcerer's staff that allows you to cast both incantations and sorceries, which is why I lean towards the staff for this build, because that allows you to use these death spells, which, you know, otherwise you wouldn't be able to use most of the time because most sorcerers are not investing into faith, so they seem to fit really well with this weapon. That's going to wrap up our level 50 builds, and the next build is going to be a level 100 Paladin build. I don't know exactly how it's shaping up yet. I'm still testing things out, but you can look forward to that real soon.